Antifragility is a mind-shifting book written by author Nassim Taleb, who's the prominent writer of the book known as The Black Swan. The book really speaks about the nature of systems and how they deal with stressors and randomness. And I do think the author really links the idea of the black swan and how it's applied in systems in this book. So I do think it's a very good walkthrough to think about the nature of systems and how specifically complex systems, which we'll define in this video, deal with stressors and randomness. And with that being said, I do think the title Antifragility is pretty appropriate in this book because really understanding the definition of antifragility in this context will make you understand half of the content of the book because of how deep the concept is. So without further ado, let's start with the first part. So Nassim starts by actually talking about the definition of antifragility and what it means. And I think it's often a misunderstood concept. And I thought I really understood it before reading the book. But then the author, when he starts, he differentiates between strength, robustness, and antifragility, which makes its definition more enlightening. So what he begins mentioning is that strength and robustness are concepts that are neutral against stress, meaning that if you subjugate them to stress, they're neutral. They don't actually flourish when they're subjected to some kind of stressors, as opposed to anti-fragile things or anti-fragility, where when you subjugate anti-fragile systems to stressors or randomness, they actually flourish. So the obvious example of anti-fragile systems include the human body, where things like bones and muscles, if not subjugated to stressors, will actually atrophy and shrink. So as long as you subjugate them to stressors, to a certain extent, of course, they will flourish against those stressors, as opposed to stagnant systems like things like iron, for instance, where subjugating it to stressors will not make it grow, but it will relatively stay the same. So this differentiation between robustness and strength at the one hand and anti-fragility at the other hand is pretty important to understanding the theme of this book, because the author starts to apply this idea to many different systems. So having established the definition of anti-fragility, which is a very crucial theme in this book, we can now turn our gaze into a small tangent about randomness, which the author spoke in more detail in his book, The Black Swan, but is actually important in understanding the theme of this book, which is antifragility. So really, the author thinks about randomness in a very unique way, where he divides randomness into dispersed randomness, small shocks of different random events. And then you have condensed randomness, where you have one event that has a large amount of consequences on the system, let's say. So there are two main types of random events in the context of this book. So to link those ideas of randomness to the idea of antifragility, which is the main theme of this book, the author really explicates his ideas that the flaw in modern times, let's say, is the constant effort to repress the dispersed type of random events. So we don't really want these small stressors. We kind of repress. And the author goes on to argue that on a long enough time frame, if you repress the dispersed type of randomness, it will start to build up, and then come back to you in the form of a big or huge type of consequential event, let's say. So this applies to the idea of political systems or economic systems or whatever it is, where you're kind of repressing any small stressors at the level of the individual or whatever it is, but that on a long enough time frame will build up in the economic system or the political system, and then ends up with a huge type of event that will cause a lot of consequences to all agents in the system. So an example he gave was a very controversial one, but it actually brings the point home. The author really shows this point by giving the example of today's nation states, where they have a centralized control, a top-down control. You could think about it as eliminating all the dispersed random events, and then that on a long enough time frame in the 19th century, with the buildup of different states and the fall of empires, have led to the stabilization or the removal of dispersed random events. And that really consequentially, the author argues, caused the events of World War I, World War II, because those dispersed events were removed, and then, as we said, they came back in the form of a big, huge consequential events on all agents in the system. So having said all of this, the author goes on to argue that in order to have anti-fragile systems, whether it's political systems or the human body or an economic system, whatever system it is, in order to make it anti-fragile, we have to subjugate it to dispersed random events instead of trying to repress those events. Otherwise, it's going to come back in the form of a large consequential event on the system, whether it's the human body or whatever it is. So if you apply it on the human body, if you don't exercise and subjugate your human body towards different dispersed random shocks, then it will come back to you in the form of a huge disease, let's say. So that's the main plot, let's say, or the main theme of this book. And the author goes on to give different economic and political systems. And I do want to say that there is a very important differentiation between complex systems and complicated systems in the book, where complex systems are the things that we could not explicate the phase space of the things it could do. So we cannot really predict its future, if that makes sense. So humans or political systems or economic systems are examples of complex systems that we cannot predict, as opposed to complicated systems like a computer program where we can actually predict all the phase space of the things it could do. So from that perspective, it seems like linking the idea of anti-fragility and randomness into one bundle is a very deep idea when it comes to designing systems or just approaching systems as a whole. And it really speaks about the fact that we should not actually strive for strength or robustness, but we should strive for anti-fragility when it comes to building systems. So with that, we conclude the main summary of the book. Thank you very much for watching. And if you like the content of this channel, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and see you next time.